He divorced his pregnant wife without mercy. 5 years later, he invited her to humiliate her in engagement, but she came as his boss's wife. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. If you're new here, don't scroll. Just breathe. You've found something different. This isn't just a story. This is a home for the heart, for healing, for hope. And you belong. Before we begin, take this. A prayer I've written with all the love in my chest. May peace fall over your life like soft rain on dry land. May the weight you carry finally exhale. May you feel love today, quiet, steady, lasting. I pray your battles are seen, that your soul knows it's worthy, that joy touches your life again, even if just for a moment. You're not lost, you're not broken, you're loved more than words can hold. Now, my family, truly, from my heart, don't leave the story halfway. Every second is made with purpose. Every word is written for you, and if it touches you, or even if it doesn't, tell me. Rate it out of 10. I want to know what you feel, not for views, but because you matter. Like, comment, share with someone you love. Let's show the world what a real family feels like, faithful, deep, and full of soul. Let's begin. With all my love, always.
The crystal chandelier above her head cast fractured rainbows across marble floors as Peggy Justice Walmsley stood in the foyer of what had been her home for 3 years, the one hand protectively cradling the gentle swell of her 6-month pregnancy, while the other trembled around divorce papers that might as well have been her death sentence. "Sign them," Christopher Walmsley commanded from behind the mahogany table, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man disposing of something that had outlived its usefulness. "My lawyers are waiting." 30 minutes earlier, she'd found him tangled in silk sheets with Veronica Sterling, blonde, privileged, and everything Peggy apparently wasn't. Now, Christopher sat in his $1,000 suit, discussing the dissolution of their marriage like a quarterly earnings report, while his pregnant wife stood trembling in the ruins of her life. "Christopher, please," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "We have a baby coming. Our baby. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" His laugh was sharp enough to shatter crystal. "My baby. You think I'm tying myself to a bastard child and the help's daughter who trapped me with it." Each word hit like a physical blow, designed to destroy her completely. "I have a reputation to maintain, Peggy, a future to build, and neither includes you." Veronica Sterling glided down the curved staircase wearing nothing but Chris's dress shirt and a victorious smirk. Her salon-perfect hair caught the afternoon light as she moved with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced consequences for taking what wasn't hers. "Oh, Christopher," Veronica purred, draping herself across his shoulders, her engagement ring, a 20-carat diamond worth more than most homes, catching the light like a weapon. "You didn't mention she was still here. I assumed you'd already handled this situation." Situation. That's what Peggy had become in her own home. Not a wife, not the mother of his child, not the woman who'd sacrificed her Harvard Business School scholarship to support his political ambitions. Just an inconvenience to be managed and discarded. "I helped build everything you have," Peggy said, finding strength in her voice despite the tears threatening to fall. "Your father's campaign, your family's investments, the algorithms that saved Walmsley Enterprises from bankruptcy. You know what I'm capable of, Chris. You know what we could accomplish together." Chris's expression twisted into something ugly, revealing the true man beneath his practiced political charm. "You really believe I'd credit the help's daughter with my family's success? You were a charity case, Peggy. My father thought dating you would help with minority voters, show the Walmsleys were progressive." He spat the word like poison. "But novelty wears off, and I have real responsibilities now." The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking, surgical in its precision. Every word was calculated to cut deepest, to destroy not just her heart, but her very sense of self-worth. This was the man who had whispered forever against her skin, who had promised to build a dynasty with her, who had traced her features in the dark and called her his goddess. 3 years, Peggy breathed, her hand pressing harder against her belly, as if she could protect their child from hearing this poison. 3 years of marriage, and this is how little it meant to you? Veronica giggled, actually giggled, like this was all some delightful entertainment. Oh, sweetie, surely you didn't think it was real. Chris needs someone from his own world, someone who understands the obligations that come with the Walmsley name. You're very pretty, in an exotic sort of way, but hardly suitable for the family that will run this state someday. The dismissal in her voice was absolute, the kind of casual cruelty that came so naturally to people who had never been told no, never been denied anything, never had to claw their way up from nothing, only to discover that nothing was exactly what they were worth to the people they loved most. Chris moved to the fireplace where their wedding photo sat in a crystal frame, Peggy radiant in vintage lace, Chris looking at her like she hung the stars. With deliberate slowness, he picked up the frame and dropped it into the fire. The glass cracked, the metal warped, and their faces melted into unrecognizable ash. Sign the papers, Peggy. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. His voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, the entitled expectation that even in her devastation, she would make things convenient for him. What about our child? The words came out stronger than she felt, infused with a mother's protective fury that was beginning to burn through her shock and heartbreak. My lawyers have ensured that any complications from our marriage won't be my responsibility. You'll receive nothing in the divorce. The prenup you signed was quite thorough. Chris's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Though I'm sure someone with your talents will find a way to survive. The way he said talents made her skin crawl, as if every achievement she'd earned through brilliance and hard work was somehow dirty, somehow less than legitimate. As if her full-ride academic scholarship, her perfect GPA, her innovative business strategies were all just tricks performed by someone who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as people like him. Peggy looked around the mansion that had been her home, at the life she'd helped build, at the man she'd loved with everything in her soul. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 6 o'clock, the same time Chris used to come home from work, sweep her into his arms, and dance with her in this very foyer while dinner waited and the future stretched endlessly ahead of them. But that man had been a lie, or maybe she had been the lie, the temporary fiction he'd told himself before reality reminded him of his place in the world and hers far, far beneath it. With trembling hands, Peggy signed the divorce papers. Each letter of her name felt like signing her own death warrant, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. Not yet. There, she said, straightening her spine and lifting her chin with a dignity that seemed to surprise them both. Are you satisfied? Chris actually had the audacity to look relieved, as if her signature had freed him from some terrible burden. Your things will be packed and sent wherever you're going. I trust you can see yourself out. Peggy walked toward the door on unsteady legs, her hand never leaving her belly. At the threshold, she turned back one last time, memorizing every detail of the home where she'd been so happy, so naive, so utterly, completely wrong about everything that mattered. Someday, she said, her voice carrying a promise that surprised even her with its quiet certainty, you're going to realize exactly what you've thrown away, and by then it will be far too late to get it back. She stepped into the cold October evening, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in her bones. Behind her lay everything she'd thought was her life. Ahead lay nothing but darkness, uncertainty, and the terrifying prospect of starting over with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing in her womb. But as Peggy Justice walked away from the biggest mistake of her life, something new began to burn in her chest. Not just heartbreak, but determination. Not just loss, but the fierce recognition that she had been settling for far less than she deserved. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Chapter 2. Rising from Ashes. 3 years after the divorce, the broken woman who once answered to Mrs. Christopher Walmsley had been forged into someone far more formidable. Someone who understood that diamonds formed under crushing pressure, and some fires didn't destroy but created unbreakable steel. Peggy Justice moved through Meridian's elegant dining room with fluid grace, balancing crystal stemware while wearing her black server's uniform like armor. The baby weight had transformed into lean muscle, earned through grueling 18-hour days, split between waitressing, her part-time tech job, and night classes for her MBA. Her natural hair formed a magnificent crown of curls she now wore with fierce pride, having learned to see herself through her own eyes rather than society's narrow expectations. "Mama, look what I drew." 3-year-old Maggie burst through the restaurant's back door, where employees' children were allowed to wait during closing time, her chubby hands clutching a piece of paper covered in colorful scribbles that somehow managed to look exactly like the Atlanta skyline. "That's beautiful, baby girl," Peggy whispered, kneeling to Maggie's level and pulling her daughter close, breathing in the scent of crayons and strawberry shampoo that meant home, meant everything good in a world that had tried to break them both. "You're going to be an artist someday." "Or a scientist," Maggie announced with the confidence only 3-year-olds possessed. "Like you, Mama. Mrs. Rodriguez says you're the smartest person she knows." Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor who watched Maggie during Peggy's evening shifts, had become the grandmother neither of them had, filling their small apartment with the warmth of homemade tamales and unconditional love. She'd been the one to encourage Peggy to go back to school, to remind her that brilliance couldn't be diminished by circumstances, only refined by them. "Table 12 is getting impatient, Marcus," one of the other servers whispered as he passed by with his own tray. "Apparently their wine isn't expensive enough, and they want to speak to someone about upgrading to something that costs more than my rent." Peggy straightened, her professional smile sliding into place like armor. Table 12, a group of tech executives celebrating some deal worth more money than she'd see in a lifetime. She'd served hundreds of tables like this one, learning to navigate the casual arrogance of men who'd inherited their positions and mistook luck for genius. But as she set down their wine, fragments of their conversation penetrated her professional composure. These weren't typical tech executives discussing stock options. They were debating advanced neural network architecture with the kind of sophisticated understanding that made her pulse race with recognition. "We need adaptive algorithms that can evolve their own learning protocols," one executive said, frustration evident. "Traditional supervised learning can't solve what we're building, but no one understands the theoretical framework required for practical implementation." Peggy hesitated, weighing years of silence against the desperate hunger to engage with minds that spoke her language. "Forgive the interruption," she said carefully, "but are you working with recursive neural networks or attempting true unsupervised evolutionary learning?" The table fell silent. Danny Gertman, she recognized him now from business magazines, studied her with eyes like dark coffee, intelligent and assessing in a way that made her feel seen rather than dismissed for the first time in years. The men looked up at her with surprise that quickly shifted to condescension. One of them, silver-haired and soft around the middle in the way that spoke of too many expense account lunches, actually chuckled. "I'm sure you mean well, dear, but this is quite technical. Perhaps you could just bring us the wine list instead." But the man at the head of the table didn't laugh. Instead, he studied Peggy with eyes the color of dark coffee, intelligent and assessing in a way that made her feel seen rather than dismissed. Danny Gertman was younger than the others, maybe 35, with the lean build of someone who forgot to eat when he was absorbed in work, and the calloused hands of someone who'd built things with his own effort rather than his father's money. Actually, Danny said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made the other men fall silent, "I'd like to hear what she has to say." He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Please, sit." Peggy glanced around the restaurant, knowing her manager would have her head if he saw her sitting with customers during her shift. But something in Danny's expression, respectful, curious, utterly without the patronizing tolerance she'd grown used to, made her take the risk. "Unsupervised learning is where the real breakthroughs are happening," she said, settling into the chair and feeling her mind come alive in a way it hadn't since those long-ago days when she'd thought she had a partner who valued her intelligence. But most companies are trying to force traditional supervised approaches because they're more comfortable with predictable outcomes. The problem is, truly innovative AI requires the system to identify patterns humans haven't even recognized yet. The table fell completely silent. Danny leaned forward, his attention focused on her with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Go on," he said simply. For the next 20 minutes, Peggy outlined a theoretical framework for adaptive neural networks that could evolve their own training protocols, essentially creating AI systems that improved not just their performance, but their fundamental approach to problem solving. She sketched diagrams on cocktail napkins, her hands moving as quickly as her mind as she described algorithmic structures that existed only in her imagination, but felt more real than anything she'd touched in years. When she finished, the silence stretched for long moments. Then Danny started asking questions, not the simple clarifications of someone trying to understand, but the complex probing of someone who grasped exactly what she was proposing and wanted to explore its implications. "Where did you study?" he finally asked, his voice carrying a wonder that made her chest tight with emotions she thought were buried. "Harvard," she said simply, "before life got complicated." Danny nodded slowly, as if her answer explained everything and nothing all at once. "I'm Danny Gertman. I own Gertman Technologies. We develop AI solutions for everything from medical diagnostics to climate modeling. And what you just described is exactly the breakthrough we've been chasing for 3 years." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, but instead of just handing it to her, he wrote something on the back. "This is my personal number. I know you're working here tonight, but would you be interested in coming to my office tomorrow? I think we have a lot to discuss." Peggy took the card, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the elegant script on the back. "The most impressive mind I've encountered in years. D.G. I should get back to work," she said, standing on unsteady legs as the reality of what had just happened hit her. This couldn't be real. Men like Danny Gertman didn't offer opportunities to women like her, women who'd been discarded, who waited tables and lived in one-bedroom apartments and raised their daughters alone. "Peggy," Danny called as she turned away, and something in the way he said her name made her look back. "Whatever brought you to this point in your life, it wasn't a failure, it was preparation." That night, after Maggie was asleep and the small apartment was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner they couldn't quite afford, Peggy sat at their tiny kitchen table with Danny's business card in her hands and her laptop open to his company's website. Gertman Technologies was everything she'd dreamed of building herself: innovative, ethical, focused on using artificial intelligence to solve real-world problems rather than just generate profit. The company's mission statement spoke of breaking down barriers, creating opportunities, and believing that genius could come from anywhere if given the chance to flourish. And Danny Gertman himself was a revelation. Born to a single mother in Detroit, he'd built his company from nothing through pure innovation and relentless work. His personal story was one of transformation, of refusing to accept limitations, of turning adversity into advantage. He was everything Chris Walmsley had pretended to be but never was, genuinely self-made, truly brilliant, and apparently capable of seeing worth in people, regardless of their circumstances. The next morning, Peggy dropped Maggie off at daycare with shaking hands and a heart full of hope she was afraid to acknowledge. She'd borrowed a business suit from her neighbor, spent her last $20 on a taxi to Danny's office building, and walked into the gleaming lobby feeling like an imposter in her own skin. But when the elevator doors opened on the 15th floor and she saw Danny waiting for her, with a smile that seemed to light up the entire space, she remembered who she really was beneath all the fear and self-doubt. She was Peggy Justice, and she was done settling for less than she deserved. "Ready to change the world?" Danny asked, extending his hand to her. For the first time in 3 years, Peggy smiled with her whole heart. "I've been ready my entire life." Chapter 3. Love Conquers All. 18 months after their first meeting, Peggy stood before the mirror in Danny's penthouse suite, transformed by love and partnership into the radiant woman she'd always been meant to become. The ivory silk gown was Parisian haute couture, but the real magic was the confidence radiating from her face, the self-assurance that bloomed when someone saw and celebrated your true worth. "Mama, you're the most beautiful princess ever," 4-year-old Maggie declared, bouncing on the bed in her matching blush-pink dress, pearl-adorned curls catching the afternoon sunlight. "Not a princess, sweetheart," Peggy corrected gently, adjusting Maggie's flower crown. "I'm just me, the real me, and that's infinitely better than any fairy tale." The transformation had been remarkable. When Danny offered Peggy the position of Chief Innovation Officer at Gertman Technologies, she'd channeled her suppressed brilliance into revolutionary work. Together, they'd developed AI systems that transformed medical diagnostics, created educational platforms for underserved communities, and built technology that improved lives rather than just generating profit. But watching Danny fall in love with Maggie had been the most beautiful surprise. From their awkward first meeting, Maggie hiding behind Peggy's legs before announcing Danny had kind teddy bear eyes, he'd embraced fatherhood with characteristic innovation and dedication. He'd learned to braid hair from YouTube videos, spent weekends building elaborate pillow forts in his penthouse living room, and patiently answered Maggie's endless questions about computers and rockets and why the sky was blue. When Maggie had her first nightmare in their new home, it was Danny who'd sat up all night reading her stories until she felt safe again. "Are you ready for this?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, appearing in the doorway with tears in her eyes and a corsage in her hands. She'd become more than a babysitter or neighbor. She was the grandmother Maggie had never known and the mother figure Peggy had desperately needed during the darkest periods of rebuilding her life. "I've never been more ready for anything," Peggy said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The wedding ceremony took place in the garden of Danny's estate, a sprawling property in the hills outside Atlanta that he'd bought specifically because it had enough space for Maggie to run and play, enough rooms for the family he hoped they'd build together, and enough privacy to create their own world, away from judgment and interference. Peggy walked down the petal-strewn aisle alone, her head held high, carrying a bouquet of white roses mixed with sunflowers, Danny's suggestion because he said they reminded him of her strength and the way she always turned toward the light. The guests were small in number but rich in love, Mrs. Rodriguez dabbing at her eyes in the front row, a handful of Danny's closest friends and business partners, and the team from Gertman Technologies who'd become like family over the past months. But the moment Peggy's eyes found Danny waiting for her beneath the archway of climbing jasmine, everything else faded away. He wore a charcoal gray suit that made his dark eyes seem to burn with intensity, but it was his expression that stopped her breath. Wonder, gratitude, and a love so profound it seemed to make the air itself shimmer with possibility. "My beautiful queen," he whispered as she reached him, taking her hands in his with a reverence that made her feel cherished beyond measure. "Thank you for saying yes to this adventure." When Danny spoke his vows, his voice carried across the garden with quiet intensity. "Peggy, when I met you, I thought success meant building companies and accumulating wealth. You taught me that real success is finding someone whose dreams amplify your own, whose strength makes you braver, whose love makes you whole." His voice caught slightly. "You trusted me with your brilliant mind, your wounded heart, and your precious daughter. I promise to spend every day proving worthy of that trust, not just as your husband, but as Maggie's father and your true partner in everything we build together." When Peggy spoke, tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice rang clear. "Danny, you found me when I believed I was invisible, when I thought dreams were luxuries I couldn't afford. You didn't just see my potential. You saw my value exactly as I was, serving tables and struggling to survive." She looked at Maggie, then back at Danny. "You chose to love not just me, but my daughter, as if she were born from your heart. That kind of love doesn't just change lives, it transforms souls and creates miracles." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Danny's kiss was soft, reverent, full of promise for all the years stretching ahead of them. But it was Maggie's delighted squeal of, "Now you're my real daddy," that brought tears to every eye in the garden. The reception was held on the estate's terrace, with string lights creating a canopy of stars above their heads, and music that ranged from jazz standards to Disney songs, because any celebration involving Maggie had to include "Let It Go" at least 3 times. Danny's first dance with his new wife was to Nina Simone's "Feeling Good," and as they swayed together under the moonlight, Peggy felt like she was finally inhabiting her own skin completely. "Any regrets?" Danny murmured against her ear as they moved to the music. "Only that I didn't meet you sooner," Peggy replied, then reconsidered. "Actually, no. I needed to go through everything I went through to become the woman you fell in love with. I needed to learn my own strength before I could share it with someone else." Later, as the party wound down and Maggie fell asleep in Danny's arms while he carried her up to her new bedroom, a fairy tale space he'd designed specifically for her, the complete reading nook and child-sized desk for the day she'd start her own inventions, Peggy felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. "I have something for you," Danny said when he returned from tucking Maggie in, producing a small wrapped box from his jacket pocket. "Danny, the wedding was gift enough," Peggy protested, but he was already placing the box in her hands with that mischievous smile she'd grown to adore. Inside was a key, not ornate or decorative, but practical and slightly worn. "It's the key to my first apartment," Danny explained, seeing her confusion. "The place where I built the prototype for our first AI system, where I learned that dreams were worth more than sleep, where I became the man who was worthy of you. I kept it all these years as a reminder of where I came from." He took her hands, the key pressed between their palms. "But I don't need it anymore, because you've given me something better than a reminder of my past. You've given me a future worth building. This key represents everything I accomplished alone, but everything we build from here, we build together." Peggy looked at the key, understanding the symbolism and the trust it represented. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was Danny acknowledging that his individual achievements paled in comparison to what they could create as partners, as equals, as two brilliant minds united by love. Together, she agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like champion and felt like coming home. That night, in their new bedroom overlooking the garden where they'd pledged their lives to each other, Danny worshipped Peggy's body with a tenderness that made her feel like the goddess he always claimed she was. He traced every curve, kissed every scar, and whispered against her skin all the ways she'd changed his world for the better. My wife, he breathed against her throat as they moved together in perfect rhythm, two souls finally finding their missing piece. My partner, my everything. When they lay tangled together afterward, Peggy's head on Danny's chest and his fingers threading through her hair, she felt the future stretching ahead of them like an endless canvas, waiting for their masterpiece. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For showing me that I was never broken, just waiting for the right person to see me as whole." Danny's arms tightened around her, and in the security of his embrace, Peggy Justice Gertman finally understood what it meant to be truly, completely, unconditionally loved. Chapter 4. The Invitation. 18 months into their marriage, Peggy Gertman stood in the sunlit kitchen of their estate, helping 5-year-old Maggie with multiplication tables while reviewing quarterly reports. This domestic balance, being simultaneously a devoted mother and business powerhouse, had become her greatest source of satisfaction. "What's 7 times 8, sweetheart?" Peggy asked, watching Maggie tap her pencil thoughtfully. 56, Maggie announced triumphantly after working through the problem. "Perfect. You're becoming quite the mathematician, just like—" The doorbell's chime interrupted them, followed by Danny calling from his office. "Peg, there's a formal delivery addressed to you." Peggy's stomach clenched with inexplicable dread as she made her way to the front door, where a courier in an expensive uniform waited with an envelope that screamed luxury and self-importance. The paper was heavy cream stock, the kind that cost more per sheet than most people spent on an entire box of stationery, and her name was written across the front in calligraphy that belonged in a museum. "Mrs. Peggy Gertman?" the courier asked, though his tone suggested he found it difficult to believe that someone who looked like her could be the intended recipient of something so clearly meant for society's upper echelons. "That's me," Peggy confirmed, signing for the delivery with hands that trembled slightly as recognition began to creep up her spine like ice water. The moment the courier left, Danny appeared at her side, his presence immediately calming her racing heart. "What is it, love?" he asked, noting her pale complexion and the way she held the envelope like it might contain anthrax. Together they opened it in Danny's office, and the contents made Peggy's blood run cold. An invitation to the engagement party of Christopher James Walmsley III and Veronica Catherine Sterling, to be held at the Grand Belmont Hotel, the same venue where Chris had once drunkenly promised they'd renew their vows for their 10th anniversary, back when Peggy had believed such promises meant something. The invitation was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive ostentation designed to intimidate and exclude while technically remaining civil. The dress code was black tie formal. The guest list would include Atlanta's most distinguished families, and the celebration would feature an evening of refined elegance befitting the union of two of society's most prominent young leaders. But it was the handwritten note clipped to the back that made Peggy's hands shake with rage. "Peggy, I thought you should know that I'm finally marrying someone appropriate. I do hope you can attend, though I understand if the dress code is challenging. C.W." The condescension dripped from every word, the implication clear. He expected her to either stay away in shame or show up looking shabby and out of place, a reminder to everyone present of what happened when people forgot their station in life. Danny read the note over her shoulder, and she felt his entire body go rigid with protective fury. That arrogant piece of— He caught himself, remembering that Maggie was playing in the next room. "Peggy, we don't have to do this. You don't owe him anything, least of all your presence at his circus." But as Peggy stared at the invitation, something began to burn in her chest that had nothing to do with hurt and everything to do with justice. Chris thought he was summoning her to witness his triumph, to remind her of her place in the hierarchy he'd been born into. He had no idea that he was actually inviting his own destruction. "Danny," she said slowly, her mind already racing through possibilities. Who did we recently acquire that handles event management and luxury hospitality? Danny's eyebrows rose as he caught on to her train of thought. Sterling Events Management, he said, and they looked at each other as the delicious irony hit them both. We bought them 3 months ago when they were struggling financially, their biggest client. He paused, checking his memory. The Grand Belmont Hotel, Peggy finished, her smile sharp enough to cut diamonds. Which means we're not just guests at this party, Danny. We're the hosts. Over the next hour, they called their legal team and discovered that the acquisition had been even more comprehensive than they'd realized. Gertman Technologies now owned not just Sterling Events Management, but also the company that provided the hotel's security systems, the catering service that would handle the food, and even the florist who would provide the decorations. Chris Walmsley's engagement party would be entirely dependent on companies owned by the woman he'd thrown away like garbage. He has no idea, Danny said, scrolling through the acquisition documents on his computer. The paperwork went through our holding company. There's no obvious connection to us. As far as he knows, he's just hired the best vendors money can buy. Peggy leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the delicious possibilities. He invited me to humiliate me, to remind everyone that I'm the discarded wife who didn't measure up. But what he's actually done is give me a stage, an audience, and complete control over every aspect of his special evening. "What are you thinking?" Danny asked, though his grin suggested he was already enjoying whatever revenge she was plotting. "I'm thinking," Peggy said, pulling out her phone to call their stylist, "that Chris Walmsley is about to learn the difference between being born with advantages and actually deserving them. I'm thinking it's time Atlanta's elite met the real Mrs. Gertman." That afternoon, while Maggie was at her music lesson, Peggy and Danny drove to the most exclusive boutique in the city, where the designer herself came out to personally assist them. Word had already spread through Atlanta's fashion scene about the mysterious Mrs. Gertman, the brilliant, beautiful woman who'd appeared seemingly from nowhere to co-run one of the most successful tech companies in the country. "I need something that makes a statement," Peggy told the designer, a elegant woman named Isabella who'd dressed celebrities and royalty. "Something that says I belong at the top of any room I enter." Isabella's eyes lit up with creative excitement as she studied Peggy's figure, her coloring, and most importantly, the confidence that radiated from her like heat from a flame. "I have exactly the thing," she said, disappearing into the back of the boutique before returning with a gown that made Peggy's breath catch. It was deep emerald green silk that seemed to capture and reflect light like liquid jewelry, cut to showcase Peggy's curves while maintaining an elegance that bordered on regal. The neckline was modest but sophisticated, the silhouette timeless but unmistakably modern. When Peggy emerged from the fitting room wearing it, Danny's expression of pure awe made her feel like the goddess he always claimed she was. "You look like you could rule the world," he said softly, his voice thick with pride and desire. "Good," Peggy replied, meeting her own eyes in the mirror and seeing the woman she'd always been meant to become. "Because that's exactly what I plan to do." The finishing touches were just as important as the dress itself. Isabella selected jewelry from her private collection, a diamond necklace that had once belonged to a European princess, earrings that caught the light like captured stars. Peggy's hair would be styled in an elegant updo that showcased her graceful neck and the regal bearing she'd developed through years of refusing to be diminished by others' expectations. But the most important accessory would be Maggie herself. Danny suggested they bring their daughter, not to use her as a prop, but to show the world the family they'd built together, the love that had flourished in the space Chris had tried to leave empty. "She'll need a dress, too," Peggy said, imagining her brilliant, beautiful daughter walking into that ballroom with the confidence of someone who'd never been told she didn't belong. Already handled, Danny said, producing a miniature version of Peggy's gown from another garment bag. Isabella thought you might want to match. That evening, as they had dinner together as a family, Peggy felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with love. She was going to that party not to prove anything to Chris, but to celebrate how far she'd come, how much she'd accomplished, and how blessed she was to have found a man who saw her worth and chose to build an empire beside her, rather than expecting her to diminish herself for his comfort. "Daddy Danny," Maggie said over her spaghetti, "why are you and Mama getting so dressed up tomorrow night?" Danny and Peggy exchanged a look across the table, and he answered with the simple honesty that characterized all their interactions with their daughter. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people from Mama's past need to be reminded that she's extraordinary. So we're going to a party to show them how amazing our family is." Maggie nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 5-year-old mind. "Will there be dancing?" "There will be dancing," Peggy confirmed, reaching across to squeeze her daughter's hand, "and cake, and music, and hopefully a few people learning some very important lessons." That night, after Maggie was asleep and they were lying in bed together, Danny traced patterns on Peggy's bare shoulder while she told him about her dreams. Not just for tomorrow night, but for the future they were building together. "I want them to see us and understand that love isn't about possession or control," she said softly. "It's about partnership, respect, and building something beautiful together. I want them to see what they could have had if they'd been capable of seeing my worth." Danny kissed her temple, his arms tightening around her. "Tomorrow night everyone in that room will see exactly what I see every day. The most brilliant, beautiful, powerful woman in the world. And they'll understand that Chris Walmsley is the biggest fool who ever lived." As sleep claimed them both, Peggy's last conscious thought was anticipation, mixed with satisfaction. Tomorrow night she would return to the world that had rejected her, not as the broken woman who'd been cast aside, but as the queen she'd always been meant to become. Chapter 5. The Grand Entrance. The Grand Belmont Hotel sparkled with crystal and gold, white roses perfuming the air as Atlanta's elite mingled beneath glittering chandeliers. Chris Walmsley held court near the ballroom center, basking in congratulations while Veronica Sterling displayed her enormous engagement ring like a trophy. "I can't believe she actually accepted the invitation," Veronica whispered, her voice carrying malicious anticipation. "Surely she realizes she doesn't belong here anymore." Chris smiled with cold satisfaction. "She'll come. Pride was always Peggy's weakness. She'll want to prove she's moved on, probably show up with some middle management boyfriend and a department store dress, desperately trying to fit in." 3 blocks away, the most powerful woman in Georgia was completing a transformation that would redefine the evening entirely. In the penthouse suite of the Ritz-Carlton, Peggy Gertman stood before a full-length mirror while Isabella made final adjustments to her emerald silk gown. The dress fit like it had been painted onto her body, every line designed to showcase the confidence she'd earned through fire and reinvention. Her natural hair was styled in an elaborate updo that framed her face like a crown, with small diamonds threaded through the curls that caught the light with every movement of her head. "Mama, you look like a real queen," Maggie breathed from the bed where she sat in her own miniature version of the gown, her 5-year-old eyes wide with awe at her mother's transformation. "I feel like one too, baby girl," Peggy replied, slipping on the diamond earrings that Danny had surprised her with that morning, not because she needed expensive gifts to feel valuable, but because he delighted in adorning her with beautiful things that reflected how he saw her. Danny emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his platinum cufflinks, and when his eyes found Peggy in the mirror, his entire face transformed with wonder and pride. Even after 2 years of marriage, he still looked at her like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe was real. "My God," he breathed, crossing the room to stand behind her, his hands settling on her waist as he met her eyes in the mirror. "You're going to stop every heart in that room." "That's the plan," Peggy said, turning in his arms to face him directly. Danny wore power like a second skin. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his presence commanding, but it was the love in his eyes that made him truly magnificent. "Are you ready for this?" "Baby, I've been ready to show you off since the day I met you," Danny replied, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made her heart flutter even now. "The question is, are you ready to remind the world exactly who they're dealing with?" 20 minutes later, their black Bentley pulled up to the Grand Belmont's circular drive, where a red carpet had been laid out for the evening's most distinguished guests. Danny stepped out first, his movements fluid and confident, before turning to help both his wife and daughter from the car. The moment Peggy's foot touched the red carpet, conversations among the arriving guests began to falter. She moved with the grace of a woman who knew her own worth, her head held high, her smile serene but unmistakably regal. Maggie walked between her parents, her small hand in Danny's while she clutched a tiny beaded purse that matched her dress, looking like the princess she'd always known herself to be. But it was when they reached the ballroom's entrance that the real magic happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "please welcome this evening's chief sponsors and our guests of honor, Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Gertman of Gertman Technologies, accompanied by Miss Margaret Gertman." The silence that followed was so complete that the string quartet's music seemed to echo like thunder. Every face in the room turned toward the entrance, and what they saw challenged every assumption they'd made about power, beauty, and who had the right to claim space in their exclusive world. Peggy glided into the ballroom like she owned it, which, technically, she did, her emerald gown flowing around her like liquid starlight. The diamonds at her throat caught the chandelier light and threw it back tenfold, but it was her bearing that truly commanded attention. This was a woman who had been broken and had rebuilt herself into something unbreakable, who had been discarded and had risen to heights her former husband could never reach. Danny moved beside her with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built an empire through brilliance and determination, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back as he surveyed the room with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person wherever he went. And Maggie, beautiful, brilliant Maggie, walked between them with the unconscious poise of a child who'd never been told she was anything less than extraordinary, her curls bouncing as she took in the grandeur around her with curious but unimpressed eyes. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating. Conversations resumed in whispers as people tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they knew. The mysterious Mrs. Gertman, whose husband's company had become one of the most powerful forces in the Southeast, was not only stunningly beautiful, but carried herself with an authority that made every other woman in the room feel suddenly overdressed and underprepared. "My God," someone whispered near the entrance, "she's absolutely magnificent." "Is that really Danny Gertman? I heard he was worth billions." "Look at that dress. That's not off the rack. That's haute couture." "The little girl is gorgeous. Look at how proud she is of her parents." But the most satisfying reaction came from across the room, where Chris Walmsley stood frozen in shock, his champagne flute halfway to his lips, and his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, recognition, and slowly dawning horror. The woman approaching him with serene confidence was not the broken, desperate ex-wife he'd expected to see. This was a goddess, a queen, a force of nature wrapped in emerald silk and carrying herself with the kind of power that couldn't be bought or inherited, only earned through surviving hell and emerging refined by the fire. Veronica Sterling clutched Chris's arm with increasing desperation as she too recognized the woman who'd haunted her conscience for 5 years. But the Peggy she'd helped to destroy no longer existed. In her place stood someone infinitely more dangerous, a woman who'd learned her own worth and refused to ever forget it again. "Christopher," Peggy said as she reached them, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone speaking to a subordinate rather than an equal. "How lovely to see you again. And Veronica, darling, you look exactly the same as you did 5 years ago." The observation was delivered with such perfect politeness that it took a moment for the insult to register. In a world where staying the same was the worst possible fate, where growth and evolution were everything, Peggy had just delivered a devastating critique wrapped in a compliment. "Peggy," Chris managed, his voice strangled as he tried to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. "I... we... I didn't expect..." "Didn't expect me to come?" Peggy's smile was radiant and sharp as a blade. "Oh, but darling, I wouldn't miss this for the world. After all, we are hosting this lovely party." The confusion on both their faces was delicious. "Hosting?" Veronica echoed, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "What do you mean, hosting?" Danny stepped forward then, extending his hand with the easy confidence of someone who'd never met a room he couldn't dominate. "Danny Gertman," he said simply, and watched as the color drained from Chris's face entirely. "I believe you're familiar with my wife?" "Your wife," Chris repeated numbly, finally understanding that the pregnant woman he'd thrown away like trash had not just survived his cruelty. She'd transcended it so completely that she now existed in a stratosphere he could never reach. "Yes," Peggy said, slipping her arm through Danny's with the natural ease of a woman completely secure in her marriage. "My husband. We've been together for 3 years now, married for 2. Danny adopted Maggie, and we've built quite the little empire together." She gestured around the ballroom with casual ownership. "In fact, you might say this party exists entirely because of us. Sterling Events Management, the catering company, the security firm, even the florist, all companies under the Gertman Technologies umbrella. So, in a way, Christopher, this beautiful celebration of your engagement is our gift to you." The words hung in the air like an elegantly delivered death sentence. Chris realized with dawning horror that he'd not only invited his former wife to witness his triumph, he'd literally paid her companies to make it possible, unknowingly funding what was about to become the most public humiliation of his life. "Now," Peggy continued, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the clusters of people pretending not to eavesdrop, "we should probably mingle. After all, there are so many people here who I'm sure are curious to meet the woman behind Gertman Technologies' recent innovations. Danny, shall we go charm some investors?" As they moved away, leaving Chris and Veronica standing shell-shocked in their wake, Peggy felt a satisfaction so profound it was almost spiritual. She'd returned to the world that had rejected her not as a supplicant begging for acceptance, but as a conqueror claiming her rightful throne. And the night was just beginning. Chapter 6. The Reckoning begins. The ballroom hummed with electric energy as Atlanta's social hierarchy experienced a seismic shift. Peggy commanded every conversation, her presence magnetizing business leaders and politicians who competed for her attention. "Mrs. Gertman," Senator Patricia Williams approached with eager deference, "I had no idea you were behind the educational AI programs revolutionizing underserved communities. The governor would love to discuss statewide expansion." "I'd be delighted," Peggy replied graciously, noting Chris watching their interaction with dawning realization that his ex-wife was being courted by people who'd never given him serious consideration, despite his family's political connections. Danny remained at her side like a proud consort, his hand resting possessively on her lower back as he watched her command the room with the same brilliance she brought to their boardroom. Maggie had been swept away by a group of influential women who were enchanted by her precocious intelligence and natural charm, each of them probably already planning to tell their own daughters about the remarkable little girl who spoke 3 languages and was learning to code. "Peggy Justice," a voice called from behind them, and they turned to see Margaret Thornton, Atlanta's most influential society columnist, approaching with the predatory smile of someone who smelled a story. I should have made the connection immediately. You're the mystery woman who's been revolutionizing the tech industry from behind the scenes. No mystery, Peggy said with a smile that revealed nothing and everything at once. Just a woman who prefers to let her work speak for itself rather than her publicity team. The subtle dig at the way most of Atlanta's elite relied on manufactured personas rather than genuine achievement wasn't lost on Margaret, whose column had the power to elevate or destroy social standing with a few well-placed words. "And how do you know our host this evening?" Margaret asked, her journalist instincts clearly sensing deeper currents beneath the surface politeness. "Christopher and I have a history," Peggy replied simply, her tone suggesting that was all the information Margaret would receive on that particular subject. But the speculation in Margaret's eyes promised that Atlanta's social scene was about to become very interested in learning more about Mrs. Daniel Gertman's mysterious past and meteoric rise to power. Across the room, Chris had finally recovered enough from his shock to attempt damage control. He approached their circle with Veronica clinging to his arm like a life preserver, his practiced political smile firmly in place, despite the panic clearly visible in his eyes. "Peggy," he said, his voice carrying forced joviality, "I have to say, you look wonderful. Really wonderful. Life has obviously been kind to you." The awkwardness of his approach was palpable. Here was a man who'd once held absolute power over her life, now reduced to making small talk with the woman who'd become everything he'd claimed she could never be. "Life has been extraordinary," Peggy agreed, her voice warm but carrying undertones that made several nearby conversations pause. "I've learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be the greatest gifts in disguise." Danny stepped closer, his protective instincts clearly activated by Chris's presence. "Christopher Walmsley," he said, extending his hand with the kind of grip that probably crushed fingers. "I've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Chris managed, though his attempt at humor fell flat in the face of Danny's cold assessment. "Actually," Danny said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "I should thank you. If you'd had any sense 5 years ago, I never would have met the most remarkable woman in the world. Your loss became my universe." The words were perfectly polite, but delivered with enough steel to make it clear that Danny knew exactly how Chris had treated his wife, and that he considered Chris to be something he might scrape off his shoe. Veronica, who'd been growing more agitated as the conversation progressed, finally couldn't contain herself. "This is all very nice," she said with the kind of bright, brittle tone that preceded social explosions. "But I think we're all pretending not to address the elephant in the room." "Which elephant would that be, darling?" Peggy asked with genuine curiosity, as if she couldn't imagine what Veronica might be referring to. "The fact that you used to be married to my fiancé," Veronica said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby guests could hear every word. "And now you've shown up to our engagement party with your new husband, trying to upstage our special evening." The accusation hung in the air like a live grenade, and Peggy could feel the attention of half the ballroom focusing on their conversation. This was the moment Veronica and Chris had orchestrated, the public confrontation where Peggy would be revealed as the bitter ex-wife trying to disrupt their happiness. But they had no idea they'd just handed her the perfect opportunity to destroy them both. Upstage? Peggy's laugh was musical but deadly. "Oh, Veronica, you've misunderstood everything. This isn't your party, darling, it's mine. Every vendor you hired, every service you're paying premium prices for, every detail of this beautiful evening exists because you're renting my companies to celebrate your engagement." The silence that followed was deafening. Chris's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror as he realized the implications. "That's impossible," Veronica sputtered, her composure cracking. We hired the finest companies in Atlanta. You did indeed, Danny confirmed with predatory satisfaction. Sterling Events Management, Meridian Catering, Guardian Security Systems, all recently acquired subsidiaries of Gertman Technologies. So, technically, Christopher, you didn't invite Peggy to your party. You hired her to throw it. Margaret Thornton materialized beside them, no longer pretending casual interest. Are you saying, Mrs. Gertman, that your ex-husband unknowingly funded his own humiliation? I'm saying, Peggy replied with silk-wrapped steel, that some people never learn to recognize value until it's too late to matter. Chris looked like a man watching his own execution, finally understanding that he'd walked into a trap of his own making. How, he whispered, his voice barely audible. How did you... When did you... When did I what, Christopher? Peggy asked with mock concern. When did I become successful? When did I build an empire? When did I prove that the woman you threw away like garbage was actually worth more than you could ever imagine? Her voice remained perfectly controlled, but there was steel beneath the silk that made it clear she was just getting started. The real question, she continued, her eyes never leaving Chris's face, is how you managed to convince yourself that I was the problem in our marriage when you're clearly the same small, petty, cruel man you always were. Now wait just a minute, Chris started, his political training finally kicking in as he tried to regain control of the narrative. No, Peggy interrupted, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who owned not just the room but the building it sat in. You wait. You invited me here thinking you could humiliate me, remind me of my place, show all your friends what happens to women who forget they're supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention men like you throw their way. She stepped closer, and Chris actually took a step back, instinctively recognizing that he was in the presence of a predator who'd finally decided to stop playing with her prey. But what you've actually done, Peggy continued, her smile sharp enough to cut glass, is give me a stage, an audience, and the perfect opportunity to show everyone here exactly what you're really made of. Peggy, please, Chris said, and the desperation in his voice was audible to everyone within 20 feet. This is supposed to be a celebration. Let's not rehash old wounds. Old wounds, Peggy laughed, the sound like crystal bells with just a hint of something dangerous underneath. Christopher, you threw your pregnant wife out of her home with nothing but the clothes on her back. You had our bank accounts frozen, used your family's influence to ensure I couldn't find work, and left me homeless and destitute while carrying your child. The gasps from the nearby guests were audible now, and Margaret Thornton was frantically taking notes on her phone while trying to look casual about it. That's not how it happened, Veronica protested weakly, but her voice lacked conviction as she looked around at the faces surrounding them, faces that were beginning to show disgust and horrified fascination in equal measure. Isn't it? Peggy asked, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone stating facts rather than opinions. Then please enlighten us. Tell everyone here exactly how you remember our divorce proceedings, Christopher. Tell them about the prenup you had me sign after I was already pregnant, the one that ensured I'd get nothing if the marriage ended. Tell them about the private investigators you hired to follow me, trying to find evidence of infidelity so you could claim abandonment. Tell them about the restraining order you threatened to file if I tried to contact you about our daughter. Each revelation hit like a physical blow, and Chris's face grew paler with every word. The political charm that had carried him through life was useless against the simple, devastating power of truth, spoken with absolute confidence. You see, Peggy continued, addressing the growing crowd of fascinated onlookers rather than Chris directly, some people think that power means the ability to destroy others. But real power, lasting power, comes from building something so magnificent that destruction becomes impossible. She gestured to Danny, who stepped closer with obvious pride and protectiveness. My husband understood that from the moment we met. He didn't see a broken woman to be fixed or a project to be managed. He saw a partner, an equal, someone whose strength would make him stronger rather than threatened. Peggy, Danny said softly, his voice carrying such genuine love and admiration that several women in the crowd sighed audibly. You don't owe these people any explanations. No, she agreed, reaching up to touch his face with infinite tenderness. I don't. But I think it's important that everyone understand the difference between a man who builds up the woman he loves and one who tears her down to make himself feel bigger. The contrast between the two couples was stark and undeniable. Danny and Peggy stood together like two halves of a perfect whole, their love and mutual respect evident in every gesture, while Chris and Veronica looked like actors who'd forgotten their lines in the middle of a performance. Now, Peggy said, her attention returning to Chris with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing to operate. I believe you had some questions about how I built my empire. Would you like me to enlighten you? The terror in Chris's eyes suggested that he very much would not like to be enlightened, but the crowd around them was too invested now to let him escape. The reckoning had begun, and Peggy Justice Gertman was just getting started. Chapter 7. Unveiling the Truth. The crowd around them had grown to include nearly half the ballroom, with guests abandoning their champagne and small talk to witness what was shaping up to be the most spectacular social immolation in Atlanta's recent memory. Margaret Thornton had given up all pretense of casual interest and was openly recording the conversation, her eyes gleaming with the knowledge that she was documenting a story that would be talked about for years. Chris looked like a man watching his own funeral, desperate to escape but trapped by the very social conventions he'd spent his life using to his advantage. In polite society, one didn't simply walk away from a conversation, especially when that conversation was with someone whose presence commanded the attention of everyone who mattered. Actually, Peggy said, her voice carrying anticipatory satisfaction, I think this audience deserves to understand how true innovation works. After all, many here are investors and business leaders who appreciate intellectual property value. Danny produced a sleek tablet displaying documents organized for maximum impact. Here's the first patent application for adaptive neural network architecture, filed March 15th, 4 years ago. The date meant nothing to most guests, but Chris's face went ashen as he recognized its significance. 3 months before their divorce was finalized, when Peggy was still working on her little computer projects in their home. That's interesting, Peggy continued conversationally, because that was exactly 3 months before our divorce was finalized, wasn't it, Christopher? Back when I was still Mrs. Christopher Walmsley, still living in your family's mansion, still working on what you called my little computer projects in the evenings. The pieces were beginning to click together for the more astute members of their audience, and Peggy could see understanding dawning on several faces as they realized they were witnessing more than just a personal confrontation. They were watching the revelation of one of the biggest business stories of the decade. You see, Peggy explained, addressing the crowd rather than Chris directly, during my marriage, I spent my evenings developing what I believed would be revolutionary advances in artificial intelligence. My husband thought I was just playing around on the computer. I believe those were your exact words, weren't they, Christopher? Chris opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Veronica clutched his arm tighter, her engagement ring catching the light as her hand trembled with growing hysteria. The truth is, Peggy continued, her voice gaining strength and authority with each revelation, I developed the core technologies that would eventually become the foundation of Gertman Technologies while I was married to Christopher. Every late night he spent out networking with colleagues. Every weekend he disappeared for golf tournaments and political fundraisers. I was here, in Atlanta, revolutionizing the future of artificial intelligence. Danny stepped forward, his tablet screen now displaying complex algorithmic diagrams that looked like modern art to most of the crowd, but represented billions of dollars in intellectual property value to those who understood their significance. These patents represent foundational technology for AI systems that learn how to learn, Danny explained, displaying complex algorithmic diagrams, medical diagnostics that improve with every patient, educational platforms that adapt in real time, climate modeling that evolves faster than human-programmed systems. The applications are virtually limitless. Conservative lifetime licensing value, Margaret Thornton pressed, sensing the business story of the decade. North of $2 trillion, Danny replied simply. The technology Peggy developed in your mansion, Christopher, while you dismissed her as playing with computers, is now the foundation for the third most valuable tech company in the world. The gasps were audible. Several business leaders stepped closer, as if proximity to such wealth might somehow benefit them. 2 trillion, Peggy repeated, letting the figure resonate. That's what you threw away, Christopher, when you decided I wasn't worth keeping. Tell me, how has Walmsley Enterprises performed since you lost access to my innovations? Chris looked physically ill. His family's company had hemorrhaged millions trying to develop competing technology, never realizing the solutions they needed had walked out their front door 5 years ago. The beautiful irony, Peggy continued with surgical precision, is that every algorithm Walmsley Enterprises has attempted to develop since our divorce has been an inferior attempt to recreate what I offered them for free, and what they rejected because it came from someone they considered beneath them. I don't see how that's relevant, Chris managed weakly, but his voice lacked any conviction. Oh, but it's extremely relevant, Peggy said, her smile sharp enough to cut diamonds. You see, everyone here deserves to understand the complete picture. When Christopher divorced me, he didn't just lose a wife. He lost the future of his family's entire enterprise. She gestured to Danny, who swiped to a new screen on his tablet. These technologies that I developed during our marriage, they weren't just theoretical exercises. They were practical solutions to problems that every major corporation in America was desperately trying to solve. Problems that Walmsley Enterprises was also trying to solve, Danny added, his voice carrying just enough emphasis to ensure the implication was clear. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, your family's company spent approximately $40 million over the past 4 years trying to develop similar technologies in-house. 43 million, Peggy corrected with obvious satisfaction. I've been keeping track. And all of it completely wasted, because the solutions they were looking for were sitting right there in their own home, being dismissed as the help's daughter playing with computers. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical force. Here was a woman who'd developed technology worth trillions while being systematically undermined and eventually discarded by the very people who could have benefited most from her brilliance. Senator Williams, who'd been watching the conversation with growing fascination, stepped forward with the kind of opportunistic timing that had made her a political success. Mrs. Gertman, are you saying that these innovations that have revolutionized multiple industries were developed right here in Atlanta by a woman who was subsequently abandoned by her husband? That's exactly what I'm saying, Peggy confirmed, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd waited years for this moment of vindication. Every algorithm, every breakthrough, every innovation that has made Gertman Technologies one of the most valuable companies in the world, all of it came from work I did while I was married to Christopher Walmsley. She paused, letting the full weight of the revelation settle over the crowd before delivering the final blow. Work that I offered to share with his family's company, work that his father dismissed as inappropriate dabbling for a political wife, work that they rejected not because it wasn't valuable, but because they couldn't accept that a black woman from a working-class background might actually be smarter than they were. The silence that followed was deafening. In one perfectly delivered explanation, Peggy had revealed not just the extent of Chris's personal cruelty, but the breathtaking scope of his family's business incompetence. They hadn't just destroyed a marriage, they'd thrown away what might have been the most valuable intellectual property development in the history of American technology. "That's impossible," Veronica whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She was staring at Chris with dawning horror as she realized that the man she'd agreed to marry hadn't just been cruel to his first wife. He'd been catastrophically stupid. "Is it?" Peggy asked with genuine curiosity. "Danny, would you mind showing everyone the valuation reports from when we first incorporated Gertman Technologies?" Danny swiped to another screen, displaying financial documents that made several business leaders in the crowd lean forward with obvious interest. Initial venture capital valuation, $50 million, based entirely on the patent portfolio that Peggy had developed. Current market cap, approximately $200 billion, making it the third most valuable technology company in the world. 200 billion, Margaret Thornton breathed, her fingers flying across her phone as she updated her story in real time. From patents developed by a woman whose husband threw her out for being beneath his social station. "The irony," Peggy said, her voice carrying a satisfaction so profound it was almost musical, "is that Christopher's family spent generations building their political influence and social connections on the assumption that breeding and background were more important than actual ability. They had a wife and daughter-in-law who could have made them the most powerful family in American business, and they threw it all away because they couldn't see past their own prejudices." Chris finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. "Peggy, please. This isn't... We don't need to air private matters in public." "Private matters?" Peggy repeated, her eyebrows rising with elegant incredulity. "Christopher, you invited me to this party specifically to humiliate me in front of these people. You wanted them to see the discarded wife who couldn't measure up to your standards. Well, congratulations, they're seeing exactly that. They're seeing a woman who was discarded by a man too stupid to recognize genius when it was sleeping in his bed every night." The crowd was completely silent now, absorbed in what had become less a social confrontation than a master class in the consequences of arrogance and prejudice. "But the most beautiful part," Peggy continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is that your loss became the foundation of someone else's empire. Danny didn't just see my worth. He built a company around it. He didn't just marry me, he made me his equal partner in every sense of the word." She turned to Danny, her face glowing with love and pride. "My husband understands that true power comes from recognizing and nurturing brilliance wherever you find it, not from trying to diminish others to make yourself feel superior." Danny stepped closer, his hand finding the small of her back in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Christopher," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of absolute victory, "I want to thank you. Your cruelty and stupidity gave me the greatest gift of my life. If you'd been smart enough to value what you had, I never would have met the most extraordinary woman in the world." The contrast between the two men was stark and devastating. Danny stood beside his wife like a partner and protector, his love and respect evident in every gesture, while Chris looked like a man who'd just realized he'd thrown away not just a wife, but an entire future that could have been his. "Now," Peggy said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence, "I believe you have a party to host. Danny and I should probably mingle with our actual peers." As they turned to walk away, leaving Chris and Veronica standing in the wreckage of their carefully planned evening, Peggy felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost spiritual. The truth was finally out, and everyone who mattered now understood exactly what Christopher Walmsley had thrown away in his arrogance and cruelty. But even more importantly, they understood what Peggy Justice Gertman had built from the ashes of that destruction, an empire based not on inherited privilege, but on genuine brilliance, hard work, and the kind of love that recognized and celebrated excellence rather than trying to diminish it. The reckoning was far from over, but this was its perfect beginning. Chapter 8: The Empire Strikes Back. 3 weeks after the engagement party that became Atlanta's most notorious social disaster, Christopher Walmsley sat in his childhood bedroom, reading legal documents that marked the end of 4 generations of family legacy. Margaret Thornton's expose had run with the headline, "The Trillion-Dollar Mistake: How Atlanta's Elite Discarded Genius," sparking nationwide coverage that transformed him from rising political star to cautionary tale. The public humiliation had triggered a cascade of consequences. Within days, Walmsley Enterprises faced investor revolts as shareholders realized the company had literally thrown away transformative technology. The final foreclosure notice, now in Christopher's hands, transferred ownership to creditors who'd mysteriously sold the debt to a Gertman Technologies holding company hours before completion. "Christopher," his father's voice had been ice cold when he'd called the morning after the party, "we need to discuss the implications of your revelations last night." Charles Walmsley III had built his political and business empire on careful calculation and strategic positioning. Learning that his son had not only destroyed a marriage that could have saved their struggling family enterprise, but had done so in the most public and devastating way possible, had pushed him beyond rage into something approaching apoplectic fury. "The board is asking questions I can't answer," his father had continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man watching his life's work crumble. "Questions about why we rejected technology that's now worth more than our entire company. Questions about how we let intellectual property walk out our front door because we were too proud to recognize its value." The questions had only gotten worse as the business community began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Walmsley Enterprises, already struggling with declining relevance in a rapidly changing economy, suddenly found itself the subject of hostile takeover attempts and investor revolts as shareholders realized the company had literally thrown away a trillion-dollar opportunity. Now, 3 weeks later, Christopher held the final notice of foreclosure that would transfer ownership of Walmsley Enterprises to its creditors, creditors who had mysteriously sold the debt to a holding company owned by Gertman Technologies just hours before the foreclosure was finalized. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Conference Room A, Walmsley Enterprises Building, 10 a.m. Come alone. PJG." Christopher's hands shook as he read the message. Peggy Justice Gertman was summoning him to what had once been his own family's building, and he had no choice but to answer that summons like a subordinate, reporting to his superior. An hour later, Christopher sat in what had once been his family's executive conference room, now transformed with sleek modern furnishings that spoke of innovation rather than inherited privilege. Peggy occupied the head of the table like a queen claiming her rightful throne, wearing a navy power suit that made her look presidential. "Christopher," she said without looking up from financial projections, "please sit." The casual authority in her voice was devastating. She owned not just this building but his family's entire legacy, and was treating him with the distant politeness reserved for useful but replaceable employees. "Peggy, you have to understand," he began desperately. "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her eyes meeting his with cool assessment. "You destroyed the most valuable asset your family ever possessed because you confused privilege with worth. You abandoned your pregnant wife and lost your family a trillion-dollar empire because you couldn't see past your own prejudices." She opened a folder, spreading financial documents between them. Walmsley Enterprises was losing $2 million per quarter when I acquired it. Negative cash flow, fleeing clients, board discussions about liquidation. Your traditional business approach was driving the company toward bankruptcy. Christopher stared at the numbers, seeing the devastating scope of his family's failure laid bare. However, Peggy continued, I believe in rehabilitation over destruction. This company has infrastructure and client relationships that could be valuable under competent leadership. She slid restructuring plans across the table. Implementation of my AI technologies, streamlined operations, ethical practices, and leadership that values innovation over tradition. She leaned back, studying him like a specimen. The question is whether there's a place for you in this new version of your family's company. The offer hung between them, director of client relations, 1/3 of his former salary, reporting to a woman he'd once dismissed as beneath his notice. Why? He whispered. Why offer me anything after what I did? Because, Peggy said softly, Maggie deserves to know her biological father is capable of growth. Because the best revenge isn't destruction. It's proving you're so far above your enemies that you can afford mercy. She stood, smoothing her skirt with movements that spoke of absolute confidence and control. You have 48 hours to decide. If you accept the position, you'll report to Director Janet Morrison, who will be your direct supervisor. If you decline, we'll provide you with a standard severance package and a positive reference for employment elsewhere. Christopher looked around the conference room where his grandfather had once made deals that shaped state politics, where his father had entertained senators and governors, where he'd once believed he would continue a legacy of power and influence. Now it belonged to the woman he'd discarded, and his only hope of remaining connected to that legacy was accepting her charity. I accept, he said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, but carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Peggy nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. Excellent. Janet will be in touch with your start date and orientation schedule. I trust you'll find the employee handbook quite different from the previous management's approach. As she gathered her materials to leave, Christopher found himself compelled to ask one final question. Peggy, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? She paused at the door, turning back to look at him with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, just the distant assessment of someone who'd moved so far beyond his capacity to hurt her that forgiveness was almost irrelevant. Christopher, she said softly, I forgave you years ago, not because you deserved it, but because holding on to that anger would have limited my ability to build something beautiful with my life. Your cruelty taught me my own strength. Your rejection led me to Danny, and your stupidity gave me the opportunity to prove that success earned is infinitely more valuable than success inherited. She smiled, and for a moment it was almost warm. So, in a way, I should thank you. You destroyed the naive woman who thought her worth depended on your approval, and in doing so, you set free the woman who was capable of building an empire. After she left, Christopher sat alone in the conference room that had once represented his birthright and now symbolized his complete humiliation and unlikely redemption. He was no longer Christopher Walmsley III, heir to a political dynasty. He was just Christopher, a middle-aged man with a second chance to learn what it meant to earn his place in the world. Outside the conference room windows, Atlanta sparkled in the afternoon sun, a city full of opportunities for those smart enough to recognize them and humble enough to work for them. For the first time in his life, Christopher Walmsley was going to have to prove he deserved what he got, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized that might be the greatest gift Peggy Justice Gertman had ever given him. Chapter 9. Love's Ultimate Victory. 8 months after Christopher's corporate humiliation, Peggy stood before her office windows, one hand on her 7-month pregnant belly while reviewing quarterly reports. Her pregnancy radiated the confidence of a woman who'd conquered every challenge while building both an empire and a loving family. "Mrs. Gertman," her assistant announced through the intercom, "Forbes is here for your cover shoot, and Mr. Gertman called. He's bringing your favorite chocolate croissants." Peggy smiled as their son responded to her voice with gentle kicks. The past months had brought triumph after triumph, business awards, magazine covers, and most importantly, watching their empire grow while their family prepared to expand. Danny burst through the office doors, carrying a bag from her favorite bakery and wearing the expression of barely contained excitement that had become his signature look whenever he talked about their expanding family. "How are my girls today?" he asked, setting down the pastries before pulling Peggy into his arms and placing both hands on her belly. "Your girls are perfect," Peggy replied, melting into his embrace with the contentment of a woman who had never doubted her husband's devotion. "And your son is practicing his soccer kicks against my ribs." "Future entrepreneur," Danny murmured against her ear, his voice filled with the wonder that still overtook him whenever he contemplated their growing family. "Already fighting for his space in the world." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by Peggy's phone buzzing with an urgent text from their head of security. Situation developing. Christopher Walmsley attempting to contact media outlets with exclusive revelations about Mrs. Gertman. Suggest immediate conference call. Peggy showed Danny the message, and they both sighed with the weary recognition of people who'd hoped their enemies had learned better, but weren't surprised to discover otherwise. "Should I be worried?" Danny asked, his protective instincts immediately activated by any threat to his pregnant wife's peace of mind. "About Christopher?" Peggy laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement rather than concern. "Darling, the man couldn't successfully sabotage a paper bag at this point. Let's see what pathetic attempt at revenge he's cooked up this time." 20 minutes later, they were on a conference call with their legal team, security chief, and public relations director, listening to recordings that their media contacts had thoughtfully shared of Christopher's desperate attempts to damage Peggy's reputation. "He's claiming that you seduced him for his family's money," their PR director reported, with barely concealed disgust, "and that you deliberately sabotaged his political career out of jealousy when he chose to marry someone more appropriate. He's also suggesting that your technologies were developed using resources stolen from Walmsley Enterprises." Danny's jaw tightened with fury, but Peggy actually laughed. "Is he serious? He's accusing me of gold digging against a family whose company I now own because it was hemorrhaging money, and suggesting I stole technology that I patented before our divorce was even finalized." "It gets worse," their legal counsel added. "He's threatened to go to the tabloids with stories about your personal life, claiming you were unfaithful during your marriage and that there were questions about Maggie's paternity." The last accusation made Danny's face go dangerously cold, and Peggy placed a calming hand on his arm before he could respond. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the ice-cold authority that had made her one of the most feared negotiators in corporate America, "I think it's time Christopher learned the difference between having power and wielding it effectively." An hour later, Christopher Walmsley sat in the cramped studio apartment he now called home, staring at his phone as it rang with calls from every media outlet he'd contacted. But instead of the interested journalists eager to hear his exclusive revelations, he was being bombarded with reporters who wanted his comment on the devastating press release that had just been issued by Gertman Technologies. The press release was a masterpiece of corporate communication titled "Setting the Record Straight: The Facts Behind False Allegations." In clear, precise language backed by documented evidence, it laid out the complete timeline of Peggy's innovations, her patent filings, and the financial records that proved she had not only never benefited from Walmsley family money, but had actually contributed significant assets to the marriage that were never recovered after the divorce. But the most devastating section dealt with Christopher's claims about Maggie's paternity. The release included DNA test results, voluntarily provided by Peggy to put all questions to rest, that confirmed Christopher was indeed Maggie's biological father, along with a statement from Maggie herself that had been carefully crafted to protect her while utterly destroying Christopher's credibility. My biological father has not been part of my life by his own choice, the statement read. My real father is Danny Gertman, who chose to love me, adopt me, and show me every day what it means to be valued and cherished. I hope someday my biological father will find the peace and happiness that would make him stop trying to hurt the family that loves me. The statement, written with the wisdom of an 8-year-old but reviewed by their legal team, was devastating in its simple honesty. It made Christopher look not just like a liar, but like a man so petty and cruel that he would try to hurt his own daughter to get revenge on his ex-wife. The press release concluded with an announcement that made Christopher's blood run cold. In response to these false and defamatory statements, Gertman Technologies is establishing a $50 million scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing STEM education to be administered in perpetuity. We believe the best response to attempts at personal destruction is the creation of opportunities for others to build better lives. Christopher's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Conference room A, 4 p.m. Come alone. Final warning. PJG. 3 hours later, Christopher sat across from Peggy in the same conference room where she'd offered him his current job, but this time her expression held no mercy, no hint of the grace she'd shown him during their last meeting. Christopher, she said without preamble, you have exactly one opportunity to explain why I shouldn't destroy you completely. Peggy, I just thought. You thought what? She interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of cold fury that made seasoned business leaders reconsider their life choices. You thought you could spread lies about my daughter's paternity? You thought you could claim I somehow cheated my way to success? You thought you could damage the reputation I've built through brilliance and hard work? She leaned forward, her hands folded on the table, her eyes never leaving his face. Let me be very clear about something, Christopher. I have been nothing but generous to you since I acquired your family's company. I offered you employment when you deserved nothing, showed you mercy when you'd earned only justice, and gave you the opportunity to rebuild your life with dignity. I know you just what? Peggy's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her professional composure he'd seen since she'd returned to his life as his superior. You just decided that my kindness was weakness, that my forgiveness meant you could continue to try to hurt me and my family. She stood, her pregnant form commanding despite her condition, and Christopher was struck again by how completely she'd transformed from the broken woman he'd thrown away to this goddess of power and purpose. Here's what's going to happen, she continued, her voice returning to the ice-cold control that had made her legendary in business circles. You're going to hold a press conference tomorrow morning. You're going to admit that every accusation you made was false. You're going to apologize publicly for trying to damage my reputation and hurt my daughter. And you're going to take full responsibility for the failure of our marriage and your decision to abandon your child. Peggy, please. Or, she continued as if he hadn't spoken, I will release the complete record of our divorce proceedings, including the recordings my lawyer made of our final conversation, the documentation of how you had our accounts frozen while I was pregnant, and the private investigator reports you commissioned trying to find dirt on me after our separation. Christopher's face went white as he realized she had evidence of behavior that would destroy not just his reputation, but any hope of building a normal life for himself. Furthermore, Peggy continued relentlessly, I will ensure that every business school in America has access to the case study we've commissioned about how inherited privilege can blind leaders to actual talent and innovation. Your name will become synonymous with catastrophic business failure for the next century. She moved to the window, looking out over the city where she'd rebuilt her life and built her empire. The choice is yours, Christopher. Public accountability and the chance to, maybe, someday, earn a relationship with your daughter, or complete destruction and a legacy as the man who threw away $1 trillion opportunity because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. Christopher sat in silence for long moments, finally understanding that he was completely, utterly defeated. Not just financially or professionally, but morally and emotionally. He had lost to a woman who was so far superior to him in every measurable way that his attempts at revenge only made him look more pathetic. "I'll hold the press conference," he said quietly. "Good," Peggy replied, returning to her seat. "My assistant will provide you with the talking points. Stick to them exactly." As he stood to leave, Christopher found himself compelled to ask one final question. "Peggy, do you think there's any chance that someday that Maggie might what?" Peggy asked, though her expression suggested she knew exactly what he was asking. "Might want to know me, as her father." Peggy studied him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been all afternoon. "Christopher, Maggie is brilliant, kind, and wise beyond her years. She's also been raised to believe that people can change and grow and become better than they were. If you can prove that you've truly learned from your mistakes, if you can show her that you're capable of putting her well-being above your own pride, then maybe." She paused, placing a protective hand on her belly. "But understand this. Danny is her father in every way that matters. I am the mother who raised her to be strong and confident and unafraid. You are the biological contributor who chose not to be part of her life. If you want to change that, you'll have to earn it every single day, and you'll have to do it without undermining the family that loves her." Christopher nodded, understanding finally that this wasn't about his rights or his desires. It was about what was best for the remarkable little girl he'd been too foolish to claim when he had the chance. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me," Peggy replied. "Thank the daughter you abandoned, who still believes people can be better than their worst mistakes." That evening, Peggy sat in the nursery of their estate, while Danny painted the final details on a mural he'd been working on for weeks. A whimsical forest scene full of animals and fairy tale castles that would welcome their son into a world where love was abundant and dreams were achievable. Maggie sat in the rocking chair beside her mother, reading aloud from a chapter book while periodically placing her small hand on Peggy's belly to feel her little brother's movements. "Mama," Maggie said during a pause in her reading, "I heard Daddy Danny talking to Uncle Marcus about my biological father. Is he trying to hurt us again?" Peggy looked down at her brilliant daughter, marveling as always at the child's emotional intelligence and mature understanding of complex adult situations. "He tried to," Peggy said honestly, because she'd always believed in age-appropriate honesty with Maggie. But people who try to hurt others from a place of weakness can never really damage those who are protected by love and truth. Maggie nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old mind. "Is he going to apologize?" "Yes, baby girl. He's going to apologize publicly for the things he said." "Good," Maggie said with satisfaction. "Maybe someday he'll be ready to meet his son." The simple acceptance in her daughter's voice brought tears to Peggy's eyes. Despite everything Christopher had done, despite his absence and his cruelty and his attempts at revenge, Maggie still saw him as her little brother's father, someone who might, with enough growth and accountability, become worthy of being part of their family. "You're so wise, sweetheart," Peggy whispered, kissing the top of Maggie's curly head. "I learned from you and Daddy Danny," Maggie replied simply. "You taught me that being strong doesn't mean being mean, and that love is more powerful than hate." As if summoned by their daughter's words, Danny appeared in the nursery doorway, paint splattered and grinning, looking like the picture of domestic bliss. "How are my girls?" he asked, settling onto the floor beside the rocking chair and placing his hand on Peggy's belly. "We're perfect," Peggy replied, meaning it completely. "We're absolutely perfect." And surrounded by the love they'd built together, love that had conquered every obstacle, survived every attack, and created a family stronger than any challenge they might face, Peggy Justice Gertman knew that their victory was complete. Not because they'd defeated their enemies, but because they'd built something so beautiful that their enemies' attempts at destruction only highlighted the magnificence of what love could accomplish when nurtured by equals who saw each other's worth. Chapter 10. Forever Reign. The morning Christopher held his public apology, Peggy reviewed board meeting preparations when sharp pain hit her lower back. At 38 weeks pregnant, she'd expected their son's arrival any day. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. She'd witnessed Christopher's final humiliation before welcoming their baby into a world where justice had prevailed. "Mrs. Gertman," her assistant announced, "Mr. Walmsley's press conference is beginning. Shall I display it?" "Please do," Peggy replied, settling into her chair as another contraction rippled through her. Their son shared his father's impatience and his mother's determination. He wanted to enter the world on this day of triumph. On screen, Christopher stood at the press club podium, looking genuinely broken. Gone was his political polish, replaced by the exhausted honesty of a man who'd finally accepted accountability. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Christopher began, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. "I called this conference to address the false and defamatory statements I made yesterday regarding my ex-wife, Peggy Justice Gertman, and her family." Peggy felt another sharp pain, stronger this time, and realized with growing excitement that their son had definitely chosen today to make his debut. She pressed the intercom button. "Please ask Danny to come to my office immediately and call Dr. Martinez. Tell her it's time." On the screen, Christopher continued his humiliating confession. "Every accusation I made was false. Mrs. Gertman never took anything from my family that wasn't rightfully hers through her own innovations and hard work. She never cheated on me during our marriage. The failure of our relationship was entirely due to my inability to recognize her worth and my cruel decision to abandon her when she was pregnant with our daughter." Another contraction hit, stronger and more insistent than the previous ones, and Peggy found herself gripping the arms of her chair while watching her former husband destroy himself on live television. The symmetry was almost poetic. As Christopher finally took responsibility for his cruelty, she was bringing new life into the world, surrounded by love and success beyond anything he'd ever imagined possible. Danny burst through the office doors, took one look at his wife's face, and immediately shifted into the protective, take-charge mode that had made him one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. "How far apart are the contractions?" he asked, already moving to help her stand while simultaneously pulling out his phone to call their driver. "About every 5 minutes," Peggy gasped, leaning into his strength as another wave of pain confirmed that their son was definitely ready to meet the world. "But I want to watch the rest of Christopher's confession first." "Baby, we need to get you to the hospital," Danny protested, though he was already adjusting the screen so they could continue watching while he helped her gather her things. On screen, Christopher was addressing the most devastating part of his confession. "I also want to publicly apologize to my daughter, Margaret Gertman, for the pain my absence has caused her, and for my recent attempts to hurt the loving family that has given her everything I failed to provide. She deserves better than the father I've been, and I can only hope that someday I might earn the chance to prove I can be better." "That's enough," Peggy said with satisfaction, allowing Danny to help her toward the elevator as the contractions grew stronger and more frequent. "He's done exactly what he needed to do. Now let's go meet our son." The drive to Atlanta Memorial Hospital became an adventure in controlled chaos as Peggy experienced increasingly intense contractions, while Danny alternately sweet-talked her through the pain and barked orders at their security team to clear traffic and ensure the hospital was prepared for their arrival. "Just breathe, my love," Danny murmured against her ear as they reached the hospital entrance, his voice carrying the same calm confidence he brought to billion-dollar negotiations. "You're the strongest woman in the world. You've conquered everything else. This is just the next beautiful challenge." "Easy for you to say," Peggy panted through gritted teeth. "You're not pushing a future CEO out of your body." Dr. Martinez met them at the emergency entrance with a wheelchair and the kind of professional calm that came from delivering babies for 20 years. "Mrs. Gertman, it looks like your son decided he couldn't wait any longer to meet his remarkable parents." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical efficiency, Danny's unwavering support, and Peggy's determination to bring their child into the world with the same strength and grace she'd shown in conquering every other challenge life had thrown at her. Between contractions, she fielded phone calls from board members, approved press releases about Christopher's confession, and somehow managed to review quarterly projections while in active labor. "Only you would try to run a Fortune 500 company while giving birth," Danny said with amazed admiration, as she finished approving a merger during a brief break between contractions. "Multitasking is my specialty," Peggy replied with a grin that turned into a grimace as the next contraction hit with renewed intensity. At 4:17 p.m., as Atlanta's business district concluded another day of deals and negotiations, Daniel Justice Gertman Jr. entered the world with a cry that seemed to announce his intention to be as formidable as his parents. Perfect in every way, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and dark hair suggesting he'd inherited his father's features and his mother's fierce determination. "He's absolutely beautiful," Danny whispered, tears streaming as he held his son. "Perfect, just like his mother." Peggy, exhausted but radiant, touched their son's tiny hand as he gripped her finger with surprising strength. "Welcome to the world, little prince. You've been born into a family that will love you unconditionally." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by commotion in the hallway. Through the window, they saw Christopher arguing with security, demanding to see his son and claiming paternal rights he'd never exercised. Danny's expression went dangerously cold, but Peggy placed a calming hand on his arm. "Let him in," she said quietly. "It's time for him to meet his son and understand exactly what he's been missing." A moment later, Christopher entered the hospital room like a man walking to his own execution, his eyes immediately drawn to the baby in Danny's protective embrace. What he saw there, the picture of perfect domestic bliss, a family united by genuine love and mutual respect, seemed to hit him like a physical blow. "Peggy," he began, his voice carrying desperation and something that might have been genuine remorse. "I just wanted to see, to make sure you were okay, to meet." "His name is Daniel Justice Gertman Jr.," Peggy said with quiet authority, her voice carrying the exhaustion of labor, but also the profound satisfaction of a woman who'd achieved everything she'd ever dreamed of. "He's healthy, beautiful, and surrounded by more love than you can imagine." Christopher stared at the baby, his biological son, being held with infinite tenderness by the man who'd proven himself worthy of being called father through actions rather than genetics. "Christopher," Peggy continued, her voice carrying a finality that made it clear this would be their last significant conversation. "You threw away one child because you couldn't see her value. You've spent years trying to hurt the family that loves her. Now you're looking at another child who will grow up knowing exactly what it means to be cherished, protected, and encouraged to reach his full potential." She gestured to Danny, who was gazing at their son with wonder and protective love. "This is what fatherhood looks like. This is what it means to choose love over pride, family over status, and the future over the past. Christopher's eyes filled with tears as he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost. Not just wives and children, but the opportunity to be part of something greater than himself, something built on love rather than obligation. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of 5 years of mistakes and missed opportunities. "I'm so sorry for everything." "I know you are," Peggy replied gently, her voice carrying the grace of someone who'd found peace with the past and joy in the present. "And maybe that's enough to start building something better. Not for me, not for Danny, but for Maggie and Daniel Jr. They deserve to know that their biological father is capable of growth and redemption." Danny stood, still cradling their son, and moved closer to Peggy's bedside. "Christopher," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd earned his place through love and dedication, "you're welcome to be part of these children's lives, but only if you can respect the family we've built and the love that protects them. They don't need you, but they might choose to include you if you prove you're worthy of that choice." Christopher nodded, understanding finally that this wasn't about his rights or his desires. It was about earning the privilege of knowing two remarkable children who had every advantage he'd never been able to provide. 3 months later, Peggy stood on the stage of the Georgia World Congress Center, accepting the governor's award for innovation and excellence, while Danny sat in the front row holding their sleeping son, and Maggie beamed with pride from beside him. The audience, composed of the state's most influential business leaders, politicians, and innovators, rose in thunderous applause as she concluded her acceptance speech. "Excellence isn't inherited," Peggy said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium with the authority of someone who'd proven every word through lived experience. "It's earned through perseverance, innovation, and the courage to see potential where others see only obstacles. True success comes not from the circumstances we're born into, but from what we choose to build with the opportunities we create for ourselves." She looked out at the audience, her eyes finding Danny and their children, and felt a completeness that had nothing to do with awards or recognition, and everything to do with love, freely given and joyfully received. "The greatest innovation any of us can achieve," she continued, "is the decision to build something beautiful and lasting, whether that's a company, a community, or a family bound together by mutual respect and unconditional love." As the applause reached deafening levels, Peggy raised the crystal award above her head, not as a symbol of individual achievement, but as a celebration of everything she and Danny had built together. An empire based on innovation, a family rooted in love, and a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Later that evening, after the reception and congratulations and photo sessions, the Gertman family returned to their estate where the most important celebration would take place in the quiet privacy of their home. In the nursery, with Daniel Jr. sleeping peacefully in his crib and Maggie curled up in the reading chair with a book about young inventors, Peggy and Danny stood together watching their children with the wonder of two people who'd built something infinitely more valuable than money or fame. "Any regrets?" Danny asked softly, his arms encircling his wife as they gazed at their perfect life. "Never," Peggy whispered, leaning back against his chest and feeling their son stir gently in his sleep. "Every tear, every struggle, every moment of pain led me to you, to this family, to this love. Christopher did me the greatest favor of my life when he threw me away. He set me free to find my real destiny." Danny kissed her temple tenderly, his hand settling over hers on the windowsill as they looked out over the city lights, sparkling below, a kingdom they'd built together through brilliance, determination, and the kind of love that conquered everything. "Our destiny," he corrected gently. "We built this empire together, my queen, and we'll rule it together forever." "Mama? Daddy?" Maggie's sleepy voice called from the reading chair. "Will you tell me the story about how you conquered the world again?" Peggy and Danny exchanged a look of pure joy before moving to settle on either side of their daughter, with baby Daniel sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. Once upon a time, Peggy began, her voice carrying the warmth of absolute contentment. There was a woman who thought she was broken until she met a man who helped her realize she was just waiting to become extraordinary. And they lived happily ever after, Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. They lived magnificently ever after, Danny confirmed, his voice rich with love and satisfaction. They built an empire, raised brilliant children, and proved that true love doesn't just conquer all, it creates miracles. As Maggie drifted off to sleep and baby Daniel stirred contentedly in his father's arms, Peggy Justice Gertman looked around at the family she'd built from the ashes of her former life and knew with absolute certainty that their reign would indeed last forever. Not because they'd defeated their enemies, but because they'd built something so beautiful, so strong, and so fundamentally good that nothing in the world could ever diminish its power. Their love had conquered everything, and their legacy would endure for generations to come.